What if I told you the rain wasn't just water, but judgment shaped into tears? Beneath the silence of the stars, long before your breath ever filled your chest, the sky once broke open, not with thunder, but with sorrow. The world, swollen with wickedness, cried out from the ground. Blood had soaked the soil. Innocence had been buried, and heaven finally answered. But this story isn't about wrath. Not only. It is about a God who wept while he watched. A God who prepared an ark before he sent the storm. A God who still sends warnings in whispers before he ever sends waters. Have you ever wondered what it felt like inside the ark? The silence after the screaming. The waiting while the earth drowned in its own sin. This isn't just history, it's a mirror. The flood came once, but the signs of its return are rising again. And somewhere deep in your soul you know this. You've heard it in the silence, in your dreams, in the ache that hasn't left. So come. Not with fear, but with reverence. Let us step into the rain. Let us walk the path of Noah. Let us remember the door of the ark didn't close from the inside. Pause here. Something in you remembers the water, and something in you still waits for the ark. What if I told you the first warning was not thunder, but silence? Have you ever wondered what the earth sounded like before it wept? Before the waters rose, before the sky cracked open with rain shaped like grief, there was a stillness that wrapped around the earth like a soft garment. A silence that sang louder than choirs, a peace so complete, even the leaves dared not rustle without reverence. The soil still remembered Eden. Its breath was warm with God's nearness. Every blade of grass, every stream that laughed through the rocks was a remnant of paradise, a song left behind by a God who once walked here. And man still bore the glimmer of that breath in his chest. He woke each day not to labor, but to listen to the quiet voice that hovered in the cool of morning like dew that did not ask to be noticed, only received. But even then, something ancient stirred beneath the silence. A shadow beneath the leaves, a fracture that had not yet opened but had already begun. The earth was young, but the ache was older than time. There among the hills that knew no war and rivers that had never carried away blood, a whisper began. Not from the mouth of God, but from the hearts of men. It was subtle. The kind of whisper that makes you question, not shout. A murmur that asked, must we obey what we no longer feel? Does he still walk with us, or was that only for our fathers? And slowly, the silence that had once been sacred became empty. The trees still swayed, but not in worship. The wind still passed through the branches, but it no longer carried a name. Man began to build not altars, but cities. He gathered stones not to remember, but to forget, to bury the sound of God's absence beneath towers of distraction. Even creation began to shudder. The animals turned their gaze inward. The stars blinked as if unsure whether to keep watching. And beneath this subtle decay, a strange hunger was growing, not for bread, but for dominion, not to tend the garden, but to rule it. The sons of men multiplied, and with their growing number came growing noise. The hush of the garden was replaced by clangs of iron, the groaning of wood bent into weapons, and the first songs that are no longer praised but boasted. And still God watched, not with anger, not yet, but with sorrow. The kind of sorrow that a father feels when the child forgets his voice, but still carries his eyes. There were still days when the sky smiled. Still mornings when the mist lingered like incense, as if waiting for someone to say thank you. But fewer voices answered, fewer hearts knelt. The earth tilted slowly toward forgetfulness. Then they came, beings not of dust but of flame and fall, the watchers, heaven's exiles who looked upon the daughters of earth and desired what was not theirs. They had once stood in the light. Now they longed for flesh. And man, the crown of creation, welcomed them, not as strangers but as gods. Together they built things not meant to be built, taught things not meant to be known, mixed seed with shadow, births of power but not of promise, and from their union came giants, Nephilim, born of heaven's rebellion and earth's invitation, men of renown but not of righteousness. Their feet shook the hills, but their hearts carried no awe for the Maker. And so the silence was broken, not by thunder but by forgetting. A world once shaped by God's whisper was now echoing with its own voice, loud, boastful, and empty. And God saw that every imagination of man's heart was only evil continually. But there was one who still remembered the silence, one who still built altars, not cities, still listened when no one else heard. Noah. But that is not for tonight. Tonight we rested in the hush before the flow. Odd, a hush that still echoes in your spirit. Have you felt it, that quiet ache beneath your ribs, that part of you that remembers Eden even if you've never seen it? There's a reason your tears fall during worship. There's a reason silence sometimes feels like home. Something in you still remembers the garden, and something in God, I still remember you. So let the silence speak tonight, not of absence but of invitation. Not of judgment, but of a God waiting to walk with you again in the cool of morning. Don't rush past this moment, don't fill it, don't fix it, just listen. The silence isn't empty, it's holy. Have you ever wondered what it would look like if angels wept while falling? What if rebellion didn't arrive with screams, but with beauty too bright to question? The trees still blossomed, the rivers still danced, birdsong still wrapped the mornings in light. But beneath it, something ancient had broken open, not on the earth but in heaven. They were called watchers. Once clothed in light, standing near the throne, their voices had sung creation into motion. Their wings had carried the weight of worship across eternity, but something shifted. Desire, a gaze too long held on the dust-bound creatures below. And then they descended, not like falling stars, but like kings. Their glory still warm with heaven's fire, their words are smooth as oil. They did not ask. They offered wisdom, weapons, wonders, and the daughters of men welcomed them, not as strangers but as gods. Have you ever felt it? That pull toward something shining, something forbidden but cloaked in light. The watchers did not come with chains, they came with gifts. They taught metal how to sharpen it into blades. They taught enchantments how to twist nature's breath. They painted eyes with kohl and taught how to charm with color, how to summon spirits with words never meant for men. And from this mingling, giants were born, Nephilim, born of heaven's betrayal and earth's longing, flesh too strong, eyes too ancient, hearts with no room for worship. They did not walk, they thundered. Every step devoured the soil, every breath swallowed peace. The people once danced under olive branches. Now they fled beneath the shadow of limbs that tore down trees for sport. Mountains once clothed in praise now trembled beneath the weight of their roars. They were called men of renown, but heaven called them abominations. Still the trees bloomed, spring has arrived, the rivers still flowed, but now blood was in the soil, and the blossoms. They grew over bones. Can you imagine that kind of silence, where everything looks holy but nothing is? Where light flickers like a lie and every breath feels borrowed. The world was still beautiful, but beauty can lie, especially when it is severed from the altar. Fathers no longer told their children the stories of Eden. Mothers no longer sang of the God who walked in the garden. Worship became noise. Altars became ruins. And the giants built kingdoms from the ashes of obedience. Cities rose with walls taller than trees. Their gates bore the faces of the fallen. Their laws honored strength but not mercy. The innocent were hunted, the meek were mocked. And the name of God, the name that once made hearts kneel, was forgot, but not by heaven. Heaven still watched, and in the throne room silence thickened. The kind of silence that gathers before a storm, the kind that drips like oil before it burns. Angels who had remained loyal turned their faces away from earth, unable to bear the sound of it. The prayers that once rose like incense now sounded like echoes in an empty hall. Can you feel it, that holy ache? The kind that doesn't cry out but mourns quietly. It is the grief of a father who remembers his child's first steps even as the child runs into ruin. And still the giants ruled, the watchers lingered, and man forgot his breath was borrowed. But not all. A few still wept at night. A few still remembered the silence that once sang. They whispered prayers into the soil, hoping it still carried God's memory. And deep in the wilderness a man was watching. Not the giants, not the skies, but his own heart. His name was Noah, but the flood had not yet been whispered, not yet. Tonight we stand among the blossoms, the ones growing over ancient bones. We listen to the ground that once shook beneath giants, now still but not at peace, because the peace was devoured, not by armies, but by angels who forgot how to bow. And sometimes when your soul is quiet enough, you'll feel it too, that ache, that fracture between beauty and holiness, that knowing that some things shine but carry shadow. You know the giants, you've seen them not with your eyes but with your soul, those towering fears, those thoughts that mock your prayers, those voices that make you question your worth. They walk beneath your ribs trying to devour your peace before it ever blossoms. But the soil remembers, so does the silence. And so do. Ease God, let that settle tonight like dew over ash. You are not forgotten, you are not small in his eyes, and even the giants tremble when he speaks. So let the whisper return, even if it's faint, even if it hurts. Let it wrap around you like oil. Let it cut like a sword through shadow. Let it remind you God still watches, even when the world forgets. What if the sky could feel shame? What if the stars once closed their eyes because the earth no longer remembered who made them? There was a day. A quiet, dreadful day when heaven stopped watching. Not because God could not see, but because the world no longer wanted to be seen. The gardens were still green. The rivers still rippled like silk. The fruit still hung from branches heavy with promise. But the breath of God had grown faint in the hearts of men. They no longer built altars. They built weapons. They no longer gathered in the hush of dawn. They danced in the firelight of their own pride. And the blood no longer cried from one place. It sang from the ground in every village, on every stone. The children of Cain had multiplied, and even those who bore Seth's blood began to forget the sound of holiness. The earth was beautiful still, but it was hollow, a temple abandoned. Men didn't just sin, they loved it. They carved idols from the same wood that once carried sacred fire. They spilled innocent blood on the same soil that once bloomed under God's whisper. And above them, heaven waited. Angels leaned over the edge of eternity, watching with sorrow, watching with silence, waiting for the command they hoped it would never come. Have you ever wondered what it's like for God to grieve? Not as a distant ruler, but as a father who gave breath to bones and watched his children turn that breath into curses. A father who wrote stars into the sky for their comfort and now watched them worship stones in the dark. There is a sorrow deeper than anger, a pain heavier than wrath. It is the ache of love that has not been returned, and that's what God felt. He looked across the earth, and every thought, every intention, every motive was only evil, continually. Even the quiet ones, even the ones who smiled. Corruption was no longer a disease. It was a language, it was a culture, it was a crown. And in that moment, God's holiness met his heartbreak. Can you imagine it? The one who split light from darkness, now holding back a flood of sorrow. The one who once said, "It is good," now whispering, "It must end." The skies, once portals of promise, darkened, not with clouds but with grief. Even the sun seemed to pause. The wind no longer carried warmth. The stars withdrew behind veils of mourning. The sky looked away, not in wrath but in mourning, not in fury but in the deep ancient silence that always comes before judgment. God did not raise his voice. He whispered. He whispered to the waters. He whispered to the clouds. He whispered to the earth that had swallowed too much blood. And somewhere in the stillness, the waters listened. Not yet, not tonight. But soon the tears of God would fall. Not one, not two, all of them. Because when love is betrayed long enough, when holiness is mocked deep enough, and when silence is stretched wide enough, it must become a flood. Not to destroy for vengeance, but to cleanse for mercy. The people did not notice. They laughed. They danced. They sang songs that once belonged to angels, twisting them into chants for idols. They called the Nephilim heroes. They worshipped what had devoured them. They crowned destruction as destiny. And the children, they learned to hate the sound of prayer. Have you ever seen light leave someone's eyes? That was the world. A world once lit by the breath of God, now flickering under the weight of its own rebellion. And still he waited. Not because he was weak, but because he is slow to anger, patient, holy. He waited for someone to look up, for someone to build an altar, for someone to weep not from loss but from longing. And in all the earth he found one, but that is for another night. Tonight we stood beneath the sky that looked away. We sit in the hush that follows heartbreak. We feel the ache of holiness withheld. Maybe you felt it too. That moment when heaven feels distant, when the silence is not soothing but sharp, when your prayers feel like stones tossed into space. You wonder if God has turned his face, if your failures were too much, if the blood in your past has drowned his mercy. But hear this, he still sees, he still waits. And the silence is not absence, it's the breath before the flood or the whisper before the rescue. Sometimes God hides his face not to leave you but to stir you, to make you ache again for the light you forgot you needed. So let it ache. Let the silence cut. Let the stillness hold you like oil on broken skin. Let the sorrow of a grieving God become the altar where your repentance begins. And tonight, don't beg the sky to look down. Beg your soul to look up. What if God is still whispering, but the world has simply grown too loud to hear him? Have you ever wondered what it must feel like to be the only soul awake while the rest of the world is dreaming in sin? There was a man. In the midst of a world collapsing beneath its own darkness, one man's breath still carried the scent of reverence. One heart still trembled when it heard the silence. One soul still built altars when others built thrones. His name was Noah, and long before rain ever kissed the earth, he heard something no one else did, a whisper in the wind. It did not come with thunder. It did not shake the mountains or split the trees. It was not written in the sky or carved in stone. It came like a soft wind in the marrow of his bones, a breath behind his eyes, a sound that felt more like knowing than hearing. And that whisper was God. The same voice that had once hovered over the deep, that had shaped stars with syllables and clothed the sun in flame, now spoke into the hollow silence of a grieving world. But it did not shout. It chose one man, one heart still pierced by holiness, one life unbent by corruption. Noah, his name carries weight in the wind. It fell like oil across the cracked altar of a forgotten world. Build, the word itself was strange. Build what, for who? Why now? There had been no flood. The skies were calm. The rivers flowed gently. Children still played in the streets, giants still roared in their cities, and the people they laughed, but heaven was no longer laughing. The whisper continued, an ark. The command came not with diagrams but with trust, not with logic but with love. The ark would be a womb in a world sentenced to death, wood shaped not by engineers but by obedience, a shelter carved by faith, sealed with the promise of survival, not comfort, not easy, but survival, sanctification. And silence. God told him what was coming, not to frighten him but to prepare him. The flood would be judgment, yes, but the ark would be mercy wrapped in timber, an altar that floated. And Noah, he did not argue, he didn't ask for proof, he didn't bargain for details, he didn't wait for thunder, he built. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? To move your hands because of a whisper no one else heard, to build something that took decades, because of a voice that only came once. Faith isn't loud, it is steady. It is the act of moving when God has only whispered once. And Noah moved. Each tree he felled, each plank he measured, each nail he drove into the wood was a prayer, a prophecy, a reply. His hands became a hymn. His sweat became a sacred oil. While the world danced in shadow, he labored in light. While laughter echoed from cities drunk on their own ruin, Noah's hammer echoed across the hills as a warning and worship. The sky was still clear, the birds still sang, but Noah, he heard the wind changing. He felt it in his bones, a divine trembling, a hush that had grown too heavy to ignore. God had chosen him, not because he was strong, but because he listened. Not because he was perfect, but because his heart still bowed. And maybe that's what God still looks for. No noise, not greatness, just a heart that still aches when it hears him speak. Maybe that's why you're still awake tonight. Maybe there's a whisper in your wind, too. A stirring beneath the surface of your exhaustion. A small, soft ache that says, something is coming, build. You don't need to understand the flood to start building the ark. You don't need the approval of the crowd to follow the voice that speaks in solitude. All you need is to listen. even if the world is loud, even if the sky still smiles, even if the giants still rule the valleys. Listen, the same voice that broke the silence of Genesis has not gone quiet. It has simply grown selective. And tonight it may be speaking to you, not in thunder, not on fire, but in a whisper in the wind. What if the instructions you're waiting for aren't coming from earth but from heaven? Can you imagine building something for a storm you've never seen because of a whisper you can't explain? Noah stood alone, surrounded by a world that had forgotten God, yet entrusted with a blueprint not drawn by architects, but by the hand of the holy. The wind carried the scent of judgment, but the voice of mercy came first. Build, he said, not with haste but with precision. An ark, not a boat, not a raft, a sanctuary, a shadow of salvation carved in wood. And heaven did not speak vaguely, it spoke in cubits, in length and width, in structure and seal, every detail intentional, every measurement divine. Because when God saves, he saves with design. The ark was not a reaction, it was a prophecy. Long before the skies would bleed, God had already drawn the door that would not drown. And so Noah listened. Wood became worship. Each tree he felled was not cut in fear, but in faith. Each plank carried the shape of a future, a promise. Hidden in grain and groove. It would be long, 300 cubits, the length of obedience. It would be wide, 50 cubits, the width of mercy. It would be tall, 30 cubits, the height of hope rising above the waves. This was no ordinary vessel. This was a womb, a tabernacle floating on judgment, a cradle for the covenant. And the pitch, the black seal that covered every seam, was not just tar, it was grace, a covering between what was within and what was coming from above, between the weight of wrath and the whisper of salvation. Have you ever felt like that, held together by something unseen, covered in something you didn't earn, but that somehow kept the waters out? You didn't choose the pitch, but it chose you. It clung to your soul like oil, holy, unshakable, merciful. Noah smeared it by hand. He didn't know yet what it symbolized, but heaven did. Because one day another covering would come, not black but red, not pitch but blood. But for now it was enough. Enough to keep the waters from devouring. Enough to hold a family when the world was falling apart outside. The door was placed on the side, not on top, not beneath, but the side, like a wound waiting to be sealed by God's own hand. Noah did not build it alone, but the design was not his, because deliverance never starts in man's mind. It starts in God's heart. And when God wants to preserve his remnant, he gives instructions that look strange to those who only see sunshine. Can you feel that? The tension of building when the sky's still blue, when the voices around you call it madness. Noah kept building, hammering prayers into every beam, laying faith into every rib of the ark, not just for himself, but for the generations curled inside his obedience. The ark was more than a structure. It was a sermon, a prophecy carved in silence, a floating altar, 3 levels, 3 stages of survival, like layers of sanctification held within divine geometry. It had no sails, no oars, no rudder, because salvation does not steer itself. It rests in surrender. It floats. It waits. It trusts the God who shut the door to also guide the waves. And maybe your life feels like that ark, sealed, still, directionless, but holy, built by obedience in a world that no longer listens, held by a grace you don't fully understand, designed with dimensions you didn't draw, and yet you remain afloat, not because of your strength, but because heaven gave you a blueprint before the storm ever came. The ark was never about escaping the flood. It was about preserving the promise. The same God who measured the ark measured your days. He counted the cubits. He sealed the seams. He saw the rain before the cloud ever formed. So if he's told you to build, keep building, even when you're laughed at, even when you're tired, even when the blue sky tells you there's nothing coming. Keep building. Let every hammer fall like a prayer. Let every cut echo with prophecy. Let the pitch be your covering. Let the silence be your blueprint, because the storm is not your end. It is only the beginning of what he plans to carry you through. And the ark is already in you, so rest. The wood has been chosen, the seal has been set, and the door is in his hands. Have you ever obeyed while everyone watched you fail in slow motion? What if your faith made you look foolish, but you built anyway? Noah did. He built while the birds still sang, while the wind still whispered peace, while children laughed in the fields and the cities feasted without fear. No clouds, no thunder, no sign, only a whisper and wood and obedience. It began slowly, a clearing in the trees, a foundation laid in wilderness silence, the first beams rising like prophecies from the dust, and soon the laughter began. At first it came as murmurs, curious glances, smirks behind hands, but then louder, sharper, more bitter than before. The prophets are always mocked before they are mourned. They came to watch him work, crowds of them, day after day. Leaning against trees, arms crossed, jokes rolling off their tongues like wine poured on sacred ground. They laughed at the angles, at the wood, at the pitch, at the silence Noah kept while they shouted. "What are you building, old man? A boat in the desert? You've truly lost your mind now. There's no flood, there's never been rain." And still he built. Each swing of the hammer was a hymn only heaven heard. Each board placed was a psalm only angels could sing. He didn't shout back. He didn't argue. He didn't explain himself to men who had forgotten how to kneel. Because when God has spoken, you no longer owe the world an explanation, only your obedience. Noah wasn't just building an ark. He was building a sermon in slow motion, a wooden rebuke that stretched across the years, a silent cry that said, "Judgment is coming." A vessel shaped not by reason, but by reverence. And the world hated it, because nothing threatens the proud like the quiet obedience of the holy. His hands blistered, his back bent, his face aged under the sun, and still he built. The altar was in his labor, the prayer was in the motion, faith was nailed into every beam. He built it with no evidence, only instructions. He built it with no timeline, only trust. And the people mocked what they didn't understand because they had silenced the voice Noah heard. Have you felt that? The ache of building while they laugh, of holding on to a word no one else heard, of standing in the middle of blue skies and preparing for a storm that hasn't even whispered yet. They'll call you mad, they'll call you weak, they'll call you delusional, but heaven calls you obedient. Noah didn't need them to understand. He needed them to repent, but they had long stopped listening, and so he kept building. The wood grew heavy in his arms, the days blurred, the decades passed, yet he remained faithful. While the world danced, he measured beams. While the crowds feasted, he fastened pegs. While they cursed God, he carved a covenant. Faith doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just keeps moving, quiet, steady, unseen, until the moment the door is shut. And then the silence began, the final board was placed, the last peg driven. The hammer fell one last time and the laughter faded. Noah stepped back, the ark stood finished. Not a monument, but a mercy. And the people, they had laughed so long they didn't notice the air had changed, that the birds had quieted, that the wind no longer played. Something sacred was shifting and no one could explain it. The sky was still blue, but it felt different, and Noah, he just stood there, hands worn, heart full. The laughter no longer touched him because he had done what he was called to do. Now it was God's turn. There's a kind of silence that comes after long obedience. A holy stillness, not empty but full. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't defend. It just rests in the weight of having obeyed. Maybe that's where you are tonight. Maybe you've been mocked for your obedience. Maybe the skies are still blue, but the ache in your spirit tells you rain is coming. Keep building, even when they laugh, even when they leave, even when your hands tremble and your faith feels thin. Keep building, because when the laughter fades, when the final peg is driven, when the ark is finished, the ones who mocked will remember the man who built anyway, and the sky will speak. Did you know? Sometimes creation listens better than the crown it was made to serve. What if I told you the animals walked into the ark with more reverence than the ones who claimed to know God? It began without a word. No trumpet, no sign in the heavens, no echoing thunder to stir the mountains awake. Just a movement, soft, certain, silent. The animals began to come, not by force, not by fear, but by knowing. A divine instinct whispered into their bones, 2 by 2, as if summoned by a voice older than thunder. as if following a rhythm deeper than any drum. They came from the forests, from the hills, from the valleys where blood had not yet cried. They came not as beasts, but as witnesses. Elephants stepped with sacred weight, their tusks bowed in solemn grace. Lions walked without roaring. Wolves came without teeth bared. The serpent slithered in silence, and even the birds lowered their wings. Noah watched, and he did not speak. There was nothing to say. When heaven moves, the wise learn to be quiet. He stood near the door of the ark, weathered hands resting on the wood he had carved with prayer and obedience. And the animals passed him like incense before an altar. Not hurried, not afraid, chosen. The world did not see it. The cities went on singing. The wicked still danced. The laughter still echoed from the camps of the proud. But out here in the wilderness of holiness, the earth was bowing. Creation was obeying. Can you imagine that? The birds, who had no tongues to praise, still moved at the breath of God. The deer, who had no priests to guide them, still followed the invisible line of obedience drawn in the air. And man, the one who bore the image of God, remained deaf. The trees knew what was coming. The wind whispered it through their branches. The ground trembled beneath the hooves and claws of creatures being tucked beneath mercy's roof. But humanity mocked. They called it foolish, a parade of animals, a waste of timber and time. They did not see that the altar was already lit, and the sacrifice would be the silence that followed. Have you ever felt it? The sorrow of being surrounded by blindness while everything in your spirit is wide awake. The ache of seeing signs in places no one else looks. You look at the birds overhead and something in your chest stirs. A warning, a whisper, a call to return to the ark you haven't built yet. Noah felt it too. Not just the obedience of the creatures, but the disobedience of man. Each paw that stepped into the ark was a reminder that instinct could bow where intellect refused. Each wing that folded beneath the roof was a rebuke to the hearts that remained proud beneath the sun. Still, Noah did not speak. Not yet. He only watched as the sacred procession continued. And the ark, once empty, once a skeleton of labor, now began to breathe. It is filled with the scent of fur and feathers, the hush of life preparing for preservation. The holy hush before the heavens would break. There were no chains, no cages, no pushing or pulling, only submission, only surrender. What man could not do with logic, the animals did with awe. And somewhere in that wilderness, the presence of God rested. Not in a temple made with stone, but in the rhythm of footsteps entering salvation two by two. This is how God works, quiet, precise, undeniable. He speaks to what we call simple and is ignored by what we call wise. The animals did not need a sermon, they heard the whisper. And now so have you. Maybe you've been waiting for thunder, for a miracle, for the sky to break open with instruction. But maybe the command has already gone out and your spirit knows it the way the birds did. Maybe the ark is open and you're still waiting for a louder voice when the whisper was enough. Don't miss the mercy because it didn't shout. Don't let intellect drown what instinct already feels. Something is moving, something is calling, and the march has already begun. Two by two they entered, not for glory, not for comfort, but because they knew the time was near. So be still tonight. And listen, if the birds knew to fly toward salvation, if the lion knew to bow, if the serpent knew to hide beneath mercy, what might your soul know that your mind has forgot? Let the silence lead you. Let the whisper guide. And when the time comes, walk through the door before it closes. What if the door you're waiting to walk through was never meant to open by your hand? Can you imagine standing at the threshold of salvation and realizing the door only closes from the outside? The ark was finished. The animals had entered. Noah's family stood beneath the shadow of mercy. And then came the silence. Not the silence of relief, but the silence that arrives right before something eternal happens. Noah stood before the great door, the last barrier between grace and judgment. It was wide, tall, hinged like a question, and there was no handle, because some doors can only be closed by God. He waited. The wood groaned in the stillness. The sun paused overhead as if even the sky wanted to witness what came next. And then, without warning, without voice, without hand, the door began to move, not by wind, not by force, but by something unseen and holy. It creaked as it closed like a final breath, a slow, heavy sound that split the wilderness in two. And as the last sliver of light disappeared, the door was sealed, not with nails, not with locks, but with sovereignty. God shut it, a gesture so gentle, yet louder than thunder. He sealed it with finality, and that was it. The age of warning was over. The world had been given time, more time than it deserved, more whispers than it had heeded, more mercy than it remembered. But now mercy had drawn a line, and the door was closed. Can you feel the weight of that? The sound of God turning silence into decision. The moment when grace, though still present, is no longer offered. That's what the ark became, a house of mercy with no way back in. A sanctuary sealed by a God who waited and finally withdrew. Not in rage, but in grief. Not in haste, but in holy sorrow, because even love must draw boundaries. Even patience has a pulse. And the floodwaters were already beginning to stir beneath the soil. The people outside still laughed, still mocked, still lived as though eternity wasn't crouching at the edge of their ignorance. They didn't hear the door shut, but heaven did. The angels did. The earth did. And inside the ark, Noah's family sat in stillness. No one celebrated, no one sang, because when God shuts a door, there is no joy in being right, only the ache of knowing others will drown outside. The grief wasn't for survival, it was for separation. And perhaps that's what holiness feels like, not victory, but it aches, not triumph, but trembling, to know you've been spared and yet carry the weight of those who would not enter. Noah didn't seal the door, because if he had, he might have opened it. He might have cracked it when the cries began, when the pounding fists of regret hit the wood, when the ones who once laughed now begged for a way in. But Noah didn't have that power. God did, and he had already made his decision. There's a sacred mystery in doors we don't control, the ones God shuts not to punish but to protect, from the flood, from the enemy, even from ourselves. Have you ever prayed for a door to open, not knowing that its closing was your covering? Some doors are mercies in disguise. Some closed gates are altars where God says, "You haven't seen it yet, but I'm saving you." The ark was sealed with silence. No command followed. No thunder split the sky, just the quiet hum of obedience wrapped in divine protection. And that door became sacred. It was not just wood. It was a line, a sword, a final breath between two realms, salvation and sorrow. You may feel tonight like you're on one side of a door you don't understand. You may be watching others walk freely while you sit inside something you didn't choose to build, wondering why it feels so quiet, so confined, so sealed. But maybe the silence is not absent, maybe it's protection. Maybe God has shut a door you would have left it open too long. Maybe he's closing the gap between your obedience and the flood that would have swallowed you whole. Noah didn't need to understand the timing. He just needed to trust the hand that moved what he could not. So do you. Don't force open what God has sealed. Don't curse the silence that's keeping you dry. Some doors are sealed with pitch, but held together with tears. So breathe, sit still. Wait in the hush of holy separation. Because if the door is shut, it means he has already begun to carry you through. Have you ever heard rain before it makes a sound? Have you ever felt the sky hold its breath? It didn't begin with thunder, it never does. The first drop was soft, small, almost delicate. It fell like a whisper onto the dust. Not a roar, not a flood, just a tear. The people outside didn't notice. Not at first. They were still dancing, I'm still laughing. Still mocking the wooden vessel resting like a giant question mark in the wilderness. The ones who had pointed at Noah for years still pointed. Where's your flood, old man? Where's your voice from heaven? Where is this God who hides behind wood and fear? And then another drop, and another, barely enough to darken the soil, barely enough to stir the wind, but heaven was unraveling, quietly, completely. The sky had been holding back for generations. Now it could no longer remain still. What man mocked, God mourned. This wasn't just water, it was sorrow falling from above, grief pressed into droplets. Mercy turned bitter with time. The earth received it like a sigh, the beginning of uncreation, because before God rebuilt, he would wash, and before he washed, he would weep. The laughter grew quieter. The villagers began to glance upward, not with fear, not yet, just curiosity. Rain here. It had never rained before, not like this. They had heard the stories, but they had never felt the sky cry. Children reached out to catch it. Mothers pulled garments tighter. Fathers squinted, calculating if it would pass, but it didn't. The clouds thickened like bruises. The light dimmed without sunset. The wind changed tone, no longer playful but heavy, pregnant with reckoning. And Noah sat inside the ark still. He didn't celebrate, didn't cheer, didn't say, "I told you so." Because this wasn't a victory, it was a funeral. The sound of the first drop was the sound of the last chance falling away. Outside, panic still hadn't arrived. Denial is a powerful thing. It wears the mask of control until the flood touches your ankles. But inside Noah's chest, something cracked open, a groan too deep for words. A fire pressed into silence. He had warned them. He had wept for them. He had built with hands blistered by obedience. But no one came. Now the door was shut, and the first drop had fallen. The second came faster. Then the third. Then came the roar, not from above but from below. The fountains of the deep burst open, as if the earth itself could no longer carry the weight of humanity's rebellion. Water from above, water from beneath, wrath from heaven, grief from earth, and in the middle wood, an ark sealed in oil and trust. Inside, the air grew thick, dark, still. The animals stirred. The silence pressed against their instincts, but none of them cried out. Only the rain did. It feels like memories, like judgment, like love that had been ignored too long. It wasn't punishment for punishment's sake. It was purification, a great washing, a sacred drowning of everything that refused to bow. The laughter was gone now, replaced by whispers, then by murmurs, then by fear. Fathers held children tighter, mothers searched for shelter. The sky no longer wept, it opened its mouth. Thunder cracked, not just in the clouds, but in the conscience. And finally, the people began to run. But the door had already closed. Not by Noah's hand, but by God's. And what God shuts, no hand can pry open. They pounded, they screamed. They cried for mercy in the very voice they once used to curse, but the rain did not listen, because the time for listening was over. It had passed with the seasons. It had slipped away with every ignored warning, every scoff, every joke. Now there was only the sound of water, water colliding with dust, water swallowing voices, water rising like judgment with wings. Inside the ark, Noah wept. Not for the world, but for what could have been. And maybe that's what God feels every time we delay repentance. Every time we trade holiness for comfort, altars for idols, whispers for noise. The flood doesn't always come as water. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it's the withdrawal of peace. Sometimes it's the moment you realize the door has already closed and you are still standing outside. So tonight, listen for the drop, the small one, the gentle one, the first sign that the season is changing, that mercy is shifting, that God is about to move. Don't wait for the thunder, he always whispers first. And when the drop falls, don't run. What if the sky could bleed? What if the heavens held back their pain for so long that when they finally opened, they didn't whisper, they wept? The door had been sealed. The first drops had fallen. But what came next? It was not raining. It was released. It was judgment pressed through the wounds of heaven. Because mercy, when refused long enough, must make room for justice. The silence of God ended not with words, but with water. The fountains of the deep broke first, not from the sky, but from beneath. As if the earth itself could no longer hold the weight of sin. As if the ground, which had swallowed the blood of Abel and the cries of the innocent and the footsteps of those who mocked the ark, finally cracked beneath the pressure. The deep roared, not like an ocean, but like a wound. Springs that had once nourished life now gushed with fury. Water exploded from below, not to cleanse, but to confront. And then the heavens responded. The windows of the sky, long shut, long restrained, broke open like thunder made visible. Rain did not fall, it poured, it screamed. It collided with the flood from beneath like a sword meeting a sword. The world was caught between two judgments, one from the ground, one from the throne, and no place was safe. No mountain was high enough. No tower is strong enough. No city secure enough to outlast what had been sealed in the silence of God. Have you ever stood in a storm so thick you could no longer see the sky? That's what the world became. A blur of shadow and sound. A place where breath turned to panic and the ground dissolved beneath your feet. The thunder wasn't just in the clouds. It was in the soul. A groan, a reckoning, a holy ache unleashed. And all who had laughed ran. All who had mocked wept. But it was too late. This was not nature. This was not a chance. This was the unraveling of a creation that had chosen exile over intimacy. The flood wasn't raging, it was grief. It was a funeral held by the hands of God, a divine burial for a world that had buried his voice beneath pleasure and pride. Can you picture it? The hills swallowed whole, the screams muffled beneath the waves, the temples shattered, the idols floating face down in the waters they could not calm. Even the giants, those proud rulers of earth, were brought low. Their strength meant nothing now. Their bloodlines sank like stones, because when God moves, no man, no matter how mighty, can tread water long enough to undo what has been declared. And inside the ark's silence, Noah did not dance. No one sang. The storm outside was mirrored by the stillness within. Because survival, when soaked in the knowledge of what is being lost, feels more like mourning than mercy. Noah's hands trembled. Not from fear of drowning, but from the weight of knowing he was safe and they were not. The rain tapped like whispers against the sides of the ark, but beneath it was a roar no soul could ignore. Justice had arrived, not like a judge in robes, but like water that cannot be reasoned with. The fire of heaven had taken the shape of rain. And the tears of God I no longer waited. This is what it means when the heavens open. It is not always light. Sometimes it is a lament. Not all divine visitations come with warmth. Some come like a storm to break what refused to bend. Have you ever felt that kind of cleansing? When everything falls apart not because God forgot you, but because he remembered what must be healed. It is a terrifying thing to be loved that deeply. To have your idols torn from your hands so your hands can finally be free. To be drowned in your rebellion so your soul might be rescued. The flood was not the end. It was the middle. The painful middle between promise and restoration. And for 40 days and 40 nights the sky kept weeping. Heaven does not rush when it cleanses. It breaks and breaks again until every root of wickedness has been unearthed. Until every echo of disobedience has been drowned. Until only what he deems worthy remains afloat. So if you are in the flood, don't curse the water. Look for the ark. And if the skies are weeping above you and the fountains are breaking beneath you, don't panic. Sometimes the storm is not your enemy. It's your baptism. Sometimes the rain is not meant to bury you, but to bring you back to breathe. So let the heavens open. Let the wounds bleed. Let the storm cleanse what silence could not. And in the middle of the flood, trust this. The same God who opened the sky is the one who built you an ark. What if survival didn't feel like salvation, but like sorrow drifting on water? Have you ever wondered what it felt like to be inside the ark after the storm began? Not before. Not when the door shut. Not when the sky broke open. But after. After the screams stopped. After the rain turned from whisper to war. After the land disappeared beneath rising judgment. Inside it was quiet, not the kind of quiet that soothes, the kind that unsettles, the kind of silence that hums in the bones and makes you wonder if you'll ever hear laughter again. The ark didn't glide like a vessel, it groaned like a wound. Wood strained beneath the weight of grief. Animals huddled in the dark, not roaring, not howling, just breathing. The family sat scattered across the lower decks, backs against rough timbers, hands trembling from the cold, but not the kind of cold that touches skin. The kind that settles in the soul when you know you are safe, but everything you once knew is gone. Noah's wife held onto the edge of the wall, her eyes closed, as if pressing her forehead to the wood could bring some sort of nearness to the world they left behind. Noah's sons tried not to speak. There were no words. What could be said when you know the world is drowning just beyond the walls? They couldn't hear the voices anymore, but they felt them, the weight of the loss. It clung to the air like smoke after fire. There were no windows in the lower chambers, no sunlight, only lanterns, small, flickering, a breath of flame suspended in darkness. The ark was not a palace. It was a tomb of the old world floating toward a promise they couldn't see. Day and night meant nothing now. Time had blurred into waiting and trust. The kind of trust that can't be explained with words or logic. The kind of trust that only grows in the wilderness of silence. Because God wasn't speaking now. He had given instructions. He had sealed the door. He had started the rain, but now he was silent. Not absent, but quiet. And in that quiet, faith was tested like metal on fire. Noah knelt near the middle beam, his hand resting on the ark's heart. He didn't speak aloud. He just breathed slowly. He remembered the sound of laughter as he worked. He remembered the jeers, the long years of mockery, the calluses on his palms and the ache in his back. He remembered the whisper of God that started it all. But now there was only water and waiting. Faith feels strongest when it begins, when the word is fresh, when the wind of obedience fills your lungs like fire. But when the waiting begins, when the days grow long and the darkness stretches, that's where faith is forged. The ark rocked gently, but the sound of water did not comfort me. It reminded them of what they had survived, of who had not. Every creak of the wood was a memory. Every shift in the waves a reminder that they were suspended between what was and what would be. And maybe that's where you are too, adrift in something sacred but silent, held by a promise but haunted by the pain of what you've left behind. Safe but sorrowful. Sometimes God doesn't speak in the middle of the storm. Not because he's left, but because he's watching to see if you still remember his voice even when it's gone quiet. Inside the ark they had nothing to do but wait. No sails to raise, no rudder to turn, no stars to follow, only breath, only stillness, only surrender. And that's how God carries his people through the storms they cannot control. Not with steering, but with sealing. Not with answers, but with presence. And though they couldn't feel it, though they couldn't see it, though the ark drifted without direction, they were still inside the will of God. A boat adrift, but not abandoned. Grief filled the air like incense, holy, aching, real. Not because they lacked faith, but because they carried hearts that still remembered what they lost. And that's part of walking with God too, grieving what he let die, not resisting his judgment, but honoring the cost of it. Every minute that passed in that ark was a sacred ache, a prayer without words, a sacrifice of trust lit in the darkness, and still the ark held. The pitch did not crack, the water did not breach, the wood did not fail, because what God instructs you to build will endure even the storms you didn't expect. And maybe tonight your soul feels like that ark, floating in darkness. No direction, no sunlight, only stillness. But if he sealed you in, you will not sink. If he whispered it once, he hasn't changed his mind. And if the grief feels heavy, it's because what you carried was real. So let the tears fall like the rain once did. Let the stillness speak like thunder once did. And let the silence become the altar where your trust grows wings. What if the world had no more ground, only reflection? What if everything you once stole sank, the water had swallowed it all? The soil, the stone, the altars, the laughter, the towers of pride, and the footsteps of children. Gone, there was no more wilderness, no more city gates, no more sandals on dust, no more fields of grain waving beneath a kind sun. Only water, water as far as the eye could stretch, unbroken, endless, heavy. The flood had erased the line between heaven and earth. Now the sky looked down only to find itself staring back. A mirror, cold, still, holy. And for the first time, creation had no voice of its own. It only reflected the face of the heavens. No opinion, no defiance, no boasting, only silence. The kind that wraps around the soul like a soft shroud. The kind that makes you whisper without knowing why. Can you imagine floating above the grave of the world? Noah stood at the edge of the ark's upper deck. The rain had ceased, but the water had not. It remained thick and unmoving, a vast canvas upon which no man had painted anything. He looked down, and all he saw was sky. Blue, gray, gold when the sun broke through the veils of storm clouds, but never earth, not even once. The water had become a mirror of judgment, but also of mercy. Because sometimes when God drowns everything you depended on, it's not to punish you. It's to show you what you were made to reflect. Not power, not comfort, not legacy, but light. And now the water knew it. It had no voice, so it surrendered its surface to whatever heaven chose to reveal. The stars danced upon it at night, trembling on ripples like scattered silver. The moon rode its back like a prophet, watching, waiting, remembering. Even the sun, when it rose, seemed gentler than before, its fire cooled by the grief it saw below. And the ark creaked. The wood moaned softly as it floated, not with fear but with memory. Because that's what obedience feels like after the storm, not a shout, but a quiet ache. Not the relief of having survived, but the weight of being the only ones left. Inside the ark there were no cheers. Noah's family moved slowly, not out of weakness but reverence. Every breath they took felt like borrowed air, every step a prayer upon planks soaked with sacred sorrow. They did not know when the water would go down. They did not know if the earth would remember them, but they knew what it meant to be held by something holy. And maybe that's the lesson the water came to teach. When the ground is gone, when everything familiar has drowned, what will your soul reflect? Will it mirror your fear, your past, your brokenness, or will it mirror the sky? Will you become the surface where does heaven right again? That's what the flood had done. It had emptied the world, scraped it clean, stripped it bare, but not to destroy, to restore, to give it back its purpose, to reflect. And now you too are drifting, not aimlessly, but silently, in a place between what was and what will be. There is no map for these waters, no path beneath your feet, only faith. Only light above and trust beneath. So let the water mirror your maker. Let it show you what you were always meant to carry, not kingdoms, no noise, but light, holy, ancient, unshakable, just like the one who whispered the rain into the beginning and now prepares to whisper it away. Let the silence become your sanctuary. Let the groaning of the wood beneath your feet remind you that obedience is not always glorious, but it is always sacred. And when you look down and see nothing but reflection, lift your eyes higher. For even the water knows it was never meant to hold you but to carry you toward something promised. And the mirror will not last forever. Soon it will break, not with violence but with purpose. A mountaintop will appear, a dove will return, a door will open, but not yet. For now float, reflect, and let the water remind you who you belong to, who sealed you in, who will call you out. And until then, let your silence be holy. Have you ever watched something fly and realize it had no place to rest? What if the first thing released after judging wasn't peace but a raven? The rain had stopped, but the sky didn't celebrate. The clouds still hung like ashes. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction. The world was unrecognizable, not broken but buried. Noah stood beneath the open hatch, eyes squinting into pale light. His fingers, stiff with silence, unclasped the raven, black wings, dark eyes, a creature born of shadow. And without a sound, the bird rose. It didn't look back. It didn't hesitate. It shot into the sky like judgment given form, cutting across the pale heavens with wild, wandering hunger. Noah watched it disappear into the mirrored horizon, and he waited. But the raven did not return. Because the raven, unclean, untamed, unsentimental, had found what it desired, not resting, but ruin, because ruin was everywhere. The surface of the waters was littered with the remnants of wrath. The raven circled not to mourn, but to consume. It fed on what floated, carcasses, decay, reminders of rebellion. The raven made its nest in what the flood had revealed. It called no place holy. It saw no need to return to the ark. It had been lost, and it never looked back. Can you feel the weight of that? Some parts of us, even after the storm, still circle around the dead things, still feed on memories of what should have been buried. still prefer freedom without direction to obedience with silence. The raven is not just a bird, it's a mirror, a reflection of every restless shadow we carry with us even after the rain ends. Because even though judgment has passed, the heart doesn't forget so quickly. There's something in us that still flies over old ruins, something that looks for closure in what God already closed. And the raven found plenty. Because when the earth is drowned, even the sky feels hollow. It's circled and circled. A prophet of the wild, no message, no return, just wings against wind feeding on what was lost. Noah inside the ark felt the space that raven left behind. He didn't say it aloud, but something inside him ached. Because sending out a raven wasn't a test of the weather, it was a test of the air. And now the air felt heavier. The raven had not brought news, only silence. And silence can be a sword. It cuts between hope and doubt, between trust and exhaustion. Inside the ark, Noah's family did not speak of the bird. They only listened, for wing beats, for a sign, for something other than wood on water, but nothing came, because the raven belonged to judgment. And judgment doesn't return, it lingers, it haunts me. It feeds where no altar has been built. And maybe you've known that raven too. The thought that flies when the storm is over but the peace hasn't come. The memory that circles when the pain has passed but healing hasn't landed. The bitterness that rises when you've been saved but not yet restored. The raven is real, not in feathers and beak but in ache and memory. It never lands because it refuses to trust that anything good could grow again. It wanders because it fears stillness. It feeds because it cannot be filled. But Noah didn't send the raven to be comforted. He sent it because he had to know, is there anything out there that can hold life again? And the raven answered, not with words, but with absence. It was not time. The world was not ready. The water still wore the sky like a veil. There was no earth to receive anything sacred. Only the raven was willing to thrive there. But Noah, I was waiting for something different. He was waiting for something soft, something holy, something that would return, something like a dove, but not yet. The raven had to come first, because the pain comes before the peace, the wandering before the rest, the ache before the altar. That's the order of things in a world that has passed through fire. And so the ark floated on, adrift in divine silence. No answers, no signs, only faith stitched into wood and sealed with pitch. Outside, the raven circled, above judgment, within silence, restless, always looking, never landing, a shadow against a sky I'm still learning how to breathe again. And maybe tonight you feel that too, the wings beating in your chest, the hunger that won't settle, the ache that's never named. But take heart. Raven flies first, but the dove is coming. Let the sky be your mirror, let the silence be your sanctuary, and let the things that never return go. What if the only answer you received from heaven was a bird returning with nothing? Have you ever longed for a sign, but instead all you got was silence in the shape of wings? The sky had stopped crying, but the waters had not yet fallen. The world remained buried beneath silence and sea. Inside the ark, everything was still. No storms, no thunder. Only the echo of breath against wood and the creaking of the vessel as it drifted across the surface of judgment. Noah stood by the opening above, his fingers gently curled around a dove white as the last memory of peace. He looked out across the void. No hills, no trees, no mountains, just the sky reflected in the endless deep. And then he released her. The dove took flight, small and sacred, cutting through the pale stillness like a prayer released too soon. Her wings beat quietly against the sky that remembered wrath. She did not cry, she only flew, searching, not for survival but for rest, not for a place to escape but for a place to land. Can you imagine being that dove, sent out from safety into a world that offers nothing back? No branches, no stones, no earth, only the empty promise of a sky that hasn't changed yet. She flew and flew and flew. There was no place to land, no olive tree, no dry ledge, only the breathless hush of waiting. And so she returned, tired, empty, with nothing to show but her willingness to obey. And Noah, he received her. He didn't scold her, he didn't rush her. He held her gently as if the silence she returned with was a kind of answer, because sometimes not yet is still a holy word. Sometimes even the emptiness is sacred. The dove found no rest because it was not time. The world had not been softened yet. The waters had not lowered their voice. The soil was still beneath the judgment, but the flight, it mattered. The search was not wasted. And the return, though barren, was beautiful, because it meant the dove knew where home was. She came back to the hand that sent her. Can you feel that? The ache of going out into the unknown, only to return with hands empty, but spirit intact. That's what trust looks like. Not always bearing fruit, not always bringing back answers. Sometimes just returning, back to the quiet, back to the waiting, back to the altar of the unknown. The dove's journey was a sacred rehearsal of every soul that has ever cried out to God and heard nothing but their own wings echoing through the air. But listen, just because you didn't find it yet doesn't mean it isn't coming. The dove had to go so it could return again. Noah held her close and the ark continued to drift. No shoreline appeared. No mountain broke the mirror. No voice split the sky, but still they waited. Because faith doesn't collapse when the answer is delayed, it becomes more still, more quiet, more surrendered. Maybe tonight you've been that dove. Maybe you were sent out on the breath of a prayer, and you flew with all your strength, hoping to find something dry, something steady, something sacred. And all you found was more water, more silence, more sky. So you returned, not with fruit, not with victory, just with fatigue. But friends, God doesn't despise your empty hands. He welcomes your return. He gathers you to his chest and whispers into your feathers. Not yet, but soon, because he knows what you do not. He sees the mountain rising beneath the deep. He knows where the olive tree still clings to rock and sun beneath the waves. He knows how much longer it will rain, and how much longer it won't. The dove could not find rest, because God had not yet commanded it. And sometimes we're sent out not to succeed, but to learn the rhythm of return. To understand that the hand of God is a safer place than the silence of searching. Noah did not curse the delay. He waited because waiting is obedience. The ark creaked on, the dove nestled in, and heaven remained silent, but something had shifted, not outside, inside. The first flight was the beginning of hope's return, not because the dove came back with proof, but because she came back at all. So tonight, if you feel like that bird, tired and wing-worn, don't mourn what you didn't find. Rejoice in what you still know. You still know the way back. You still know the hand that sent you. You still hear the breath that released you. And if he sends you again, go. And if he doesn't, rest. Because the silence of God is not the absence of God. And the dove's return without a branch was still holy, still prophetic, still enough. Not yet, but soon. Let that be the whisper that rocks you to sleep tonight. What if the quietest answer was also the holiest? What if the voice you've been waiting for didn't come in thunder, but in the softness of a branch? The rain had stopped. The sky, once torn open, had stitched itself shut again. But the world remained hidden, veiled in water and stillness, as if creation had been wrapped in a shroud of waiting. Inside the ark, the air was heavy, not with fear, but with ache, with the quiet ache of those who have survived but have not yet seen the reason why. Noah stood again by the window, the same window he had opened days before, the same window that received the dove when she returned with nothing but tired wings and holy trust. But today, he opens it again, and this time he does not hesitate. He takes her, gentle, white, and willing, and releases her into the sky once more, the second flight. There is something sacred about second chances, about the courage to go again after the first return brought only silence. The dove disappears into the pale blue. She is smaller now, or perhaps the silence has just grown louder. She flies not knowing what she will find, but the sky is different. There is a whisper in the wind, a hush that sounds like change. The waters have begun to draw back, not in fury but in retreat, like judgment bowing before mercy, like wrath giving way to grace. And somewhere above what was once buried, a tree stretches toward heaven, its branches trembling with leaves that no flood could erase. The dove circles, pauses, and then she plucks it, a single olive leaf, soft, green, alive, not a sermon, not a scroll, just a leaf, but in her beak it becomes a prophecy. Because sometimes God doesn't shout. Sometimes he whispers through things that grow quietly. The dove turns. She returns again, but this time she carries the future between her lips, back across the water, back toward the ark, back toward the waiting. Noah sees her, his he. RT does not race. There are no trumpets, but something deep within him begins to rise, not with volume, but with reverence. He stretches out his hand and the dove lands. She offers him the olive leaf, not with urgency, not with pride, just as a gift. A small green whisper from the mouth of mercy, and Noah knows. The world beneath them is not dead. It breathes again. Can you feel that? The moment hope returns, not in fanfare, but in the fragile softness of a leaf. There is no crowd. No applause, just the quiet recognition that judgment is retreating. That somewhere roots are clinging to soil again. Somewhere the earth is being reborn. And heaven has spoken not with fire but with green. A piece of Eden held in beak and breath. God didn't need to say a word. He let the leaf speak for him, because some answers are so holy they can only be carried in silence. And the dove, this gentle priestess of the sky, was chosen to carry the sacrament. Have you ever waited that long for something small? So long that when it finally came, it didn't even need to be big, just real. The leaf was not a tree, it was not land, it was not freedom, but it was proof. Proof that death doesn't last forever, proof that floods end, proof that the hand of God had not abandoned the world he once judged. Maybe tonight you are waiting for your own olive leaf. Maybe the ark you're in feels adrift, silent, sealed. And maybe you've grown tired of sending out doves that come back with nothing. But listen, the second flight is different, and the next return may carry green between its teeth, a promise you didn't expect, a softness you thought was lost, a signal that the surface of your storm has begun to surrender. The dove doesn't stay, she delivers and waits for the next calling. Noah holds the leaf, but he doesn't rush. He doesn't open the door. He doesn't leap into the waters. He waits. Because sometimes, even in hope, we are called to patience. Even in the presence of the promise, we are not yet commanded to move. God had not yet spoken, but he had answered, and there is a difference. Noah knew the leaf was a beginning, not a conclusion. So he let the ark rock gently on the receding waves while the memory of the leaf lingered like oil over his heart. He did not need a voice. He had a vine. He did not need thunder. He had trust. The door remained closed. But the world outside was changing. And inside the ark so were they, not yet but soon. Not silence but stillness. Not exile but return. So if tonight you find yourself surrounded by floodwater prayers and windows that only offer clouds, remember the dove. Remember the leaf. And remember this: God may not speak the way you want, but he always sends something green when the season turns. A sign, a symbol, a sacred softness, not loud but living, not final but faithful. Let that be the branch you rest your heart on tonight. Let that be the whisper you fall asleep to. What if grace had a place to land, and that place was hidden beneath your flood the whole time? Have you ever wondered what mountain waited under your storm? The rain had stopped. The sky no longer bled. But still the ark drifted in holy silence, as if suspended between heaven's wrath and heaven's mercy. There were no voices, no commands, just wind, just the steady groaning of wood upon water. Inside, Noah did not pace. He did not press his forehead to the walls. He simply waited. The world outside had changed, but the soul inside the ark was still in posture, still bowed before the hush of God. And then the keel shuddered, not with chaos but with arrival, a gentle jolt, a soft tremble, as if the earth had cupped the ark in its hand. They had landed, not on grass, not on the meadow, but on rock, stone unbroken by flood, a peak that had waited beneath the weight of wrath until the water fled. Ararat, the mountain of mercy. High above what had been drowned, God chose a summit, not a valley, as the resting place for salvation. Can you imagine that? The first touch of dry land was not some low and easy place, it was a mountain. Because God doesn't call you to settle in ease after a storm. He calls you to rest where only He could have placed you. Ararat, the name itself, means the curse reversed, the lifting of weight, the undoing of exile, and it was not chosen by Noah, it was not seen by birds, it was not built by man. It was selected by God before the first drop ever fell. As the flood buried the cities, the farms, the laughter, and the idols, this mountain stood in silence, waiting to become an altar. Do you understand? Before judgment came, God had already prepared a place for mercy to land. Even in wrath, He carved out rest. Even in flood, He preserved a summit. Sometimes the place He brings you to is not soft, not scenic, not what you would have chosen. It's steep, lonely, rugged, but it is holy. Because it is where grace lets you stop drifting. The ark did not crash, it did not splinter, it rested, gentle. Why purposefully? Sacramentally. Can you feel that? The sacredness of the stillness after the storm. Noah did not throw open the door. He did not leap into freedom. He stayed. Because waiting on God's voice is harder than surviving a flood. We think the miracle is that the ark floated. But perhaps the greater miracle is that Noah knew how to wait when the waters had already gone. That he did not move just because it felt safer now. There's a kind of faith that endures the rain. But there is a deeper, quieter faith that waits for God's whisper even after the sun returns. Have you ever been there? Landed, safe, but still sealed, the door shut. The silence is weightier than before. You know you're not sinking, but you're not walking yet either. And you wonder, why won't He speak? Why won't He open the door? But listen, just because the ark has touched ground doesn't mean the time is right to exit. Just because the storm is over doesn't mean the story is. God was still working, still preparing the path, still unfolding redemption one sacred breath at a time. And Noah teaches us this, that obedience is not only in building, not only in sailing, but in stillness, in reverence, in waiting upon the altar of Ararat until the same voice that sealed the door calls you forth again. Can you imagine Noah, his calloused hands pressed against the wood, his ear leaning towards silence, not rushing, not assuming, just listening? Because the mountain beneath him was not an escape, it was a sanctuary. The ark had become a temple, and Ararat a high and holy place of pause. There is a kind of worship that happens when nothing moves. There is an offering in the stillness after survival. The mountain of mercy does not shout. It doesn't sparkle. It holds you, lifts you, keeps you above what could have consumed you. Even now, can you see it? That mountain beneath your soul rising through the chaos. That unseen grace carved before your flood even began. You were not adrift. You were guided to the very place where God would have you rest. Not low, but high. Not lost, but held. And if you're listening tonight tired of drifting, tired of silence, tired of feeling like the rain took more than you could bear, let this truth be your altar. God has already chosen your Ararat. He's already prepared your place of rest. And when the waters retreat, you will not crash. You will land, not where you planned, but where He was ordained. And you will know this rock beneath you, this high, quiet place, was carved not by flood but by love. A mountain called mercy, a stillness called grace, a pause that waits for His voice to call you forward. But for now, just rest, and let the silence be sacred. What if the stillness after survival was not a delay but a test of reverence? Have you ever stood on the edge of a miracle but dared not step forward until the voice moved first? The rain had stopped. The ark had landed. The waters, though deep, had begun to pull back. And yet Noah did not move, not because he was afraid, but because the sacred does not rush. Because those who walk with God do not follow the weather, they follow the whisper. Inside the ark, the silence was thick, the kind of silence that bends time, soft as oil, heavy as thunder. He waited, and still no door creaked open. Still no sky split with command. Only the pulse of time, only the breath of stillness. Only the weight of obedience holding him still. He had seen the storm end, but he knew God had not yet spoken. And until God spoke, Noah would not step onto land. That is the kind of waiting few understand. It is not waiting born of doubt. It is waiting for the birth of worship. Because some hearts love God enough to remain in the ark long after the danger has passed, not for safety, but for submission. Noah had survived the flood, but now he faced something harder, the silence of heaven. Not the silence of distance, but the silence of sovereignty. The kind that asks, will you still honor me when I say nothing? Will you still listen when my voice is the wind and not the word? There are those who cry out in the storm, but there are fewer still who listen after it ends. Noah listened. Every creak of the wood, every flutter of birdwing, every sound of settling water was a liturgy. He watched. He sent the raven, then the dove, not as a sign of impatience, but as offerings of discernment. Messengers released in prayer, and still he waited. Can you feel that? The ache of knowing God has delivered you but not yet released you. The tension of having landed but I have not walked yet. That slow ache of the sealed door and the silence that follows salvation. Some of the deepest trust is forged not in the fire but in the hours after the fire has gone out. The ark was no longer tossed by waves, but Noah's soul was still anchored in reverence. He knew only the one who closed the door can open it again. Not man, not might, not emotion, only God. And so he waited and waited, and silence grew sacred. That kind of waiting, it burns, but it is also a blessing. It strips away urgency, it scrapes the soul bare, and it teaches you to hear God even when he says nothing. Can you imagine being there? A year inside that womb of wood, breathing the air of animals, sleeping beside your survival, unsure of the next step. And still, Noah did not force his way out, because some doors, if opened by man, lead to ruin. And some seasons, if ended by impatience, become premature births. God was doing something. In the silence, forming the earth again, softening the soil, drying the dust, preparing the promise. Noah had to wait until God gave the word, and so must we, because the enemy doesn't always attack with storms. Sometimes he tempts us to leave too soon, to abandon the ark the moment the sun returns, to take credit for landing before God says go. But Noah, he knew better. He knew the ark was not just a vessel of rescue, it had become a temple of trust. And every hour he waited was an offering on the altar of obedience. This is the kind of waiting that reshapes the soul, the kind that turns survival into surrender. He did not wait because of fear. He waited because he remembered who shut the door, and he would not move until that same voice called him out again. Sometimes the door God closes is not a prison, it's protection. Sometimes silence is not neglect, it's nurture. God is not late. He's layering grace beneath your feet so that when you step out, you step onto promise, not presumption. Noah teaches us this. There is no shame in stillness when you're waiting on God. No need to explain, no need to rush, no need to prove, just stay. Stay when it's quiet, stay when no one sees, stay when the rain has stopped but the voice hasn't spoken. That is worship. That is war against every impatient whisper of your flesh. And that is where God makes the soil holy again. So tonight, if you are in a place where the storm has passed but the door remains shut, do not despair. You are not forgotten, you are being formed. Your silence is sacred, your waiting is seen, and soon the same voice that sealed you in will call you forth. But for now, rest your hand on the wood of the promise, breathe in the stillness, and wait not in fear but in reverence. What if God's voice didn't thunder this time but whispered through the beak of a bird? Have you ever longed so deeply for a sign that even a single leaf felt like a miracle? Noah stood at the edge of the unknown, his hands weathered by waiting, his heart wrapped in reverent stillness. He had sent the dove again, not in desperation, but in quiet hope. And when it returned, there, nestled in her beak, was a single olive leaf, small, green, fragile, but more powerful than fire, more healing than rain. It was not just a leaf, it was a whisper from the mouth of mercy telling the earth, I have not forgotten you. The storms may have swallowed the cities, the waters may have silenced the voices, but this living branch was God's breath wrapped in green. It carried no thunder, no shout, no decree, just a tender message. Life is returning, not all at once, not with fanfare, but slowly, softly, sacredly, like a song rising from the ruins. Noah held it in his hand, this tiny leaf of hope, and in that moment he didn't need a mountain to move or a rainbow to arc. He needed only this, a sign that the wrath had passed and that mercy still had roots. Can you imagine what it felt like, to breathe in the scent of something green after so many days of rot and rain, to hold proof that beneath the floodwaters of judgment life had been cradled, preserved, protected? The olive tree had not drowned. Its roots had survived the sorrow. Its branches had reached up from beneath the depths of death. And now a dove had found it, not a warrior, not a prophet, not a voice wrapped in fire, but a bird with soft wings returning to Noah's hand with a message heaven did not shout but whispered. Because some of God's greatest promises are not announced with trumpets. They arrive in the form of leaves, quiet symbols of covenant for those who have ears to receive them. The ark was still shut. The waters had not fully receded. The door remained sealed. But now something sacred had shifted. The world would live again. The leaf spoke of soil made ready, of trees bending toward the sun, of dry land rising beneath the waters, of a God who judges with fire but restores it with leaves. And Noah knew God was coming closer, not in anger, not in haste, but in holy repair. The dove did not speak in words, but the message was clear. The curse was retreating. The exile was ending. The earth was beginning to remember Eden again. Have you ever felt it? That breath of green after a long night of grief. That small sign that maybe, just maybe, your wilderness is about to bloom. That the season of silence has not been wasted but watered. This is how God moves when the storm ends. No. Always with answers but with symbols, not with explanations but with presence. Sometimes all he sends is a leaf, but that is everything, a promise, a covenant, a future. The olive leaf did not just say the waters are going down. It said, my mercy is still rooted, my covenant still stands, I remember my creation. And Noah, he didn't run to open the door. He didn't break the silence with a shout. He simply held the branch as if it were sacred, because it was. It had survived judgment. It had been touched by the hand of God, and now it was touching him. There is a quiet power in those who can wait long enough to receive the soft signs, not the crowd, not loud, but the remnant, the still ones, the watchers at the window, the lovers of silence, the ones who have learned that the voice of God often rides on wings. Tonight, if you've been waiting for thunder to answer you, but the heavens have stayed quiet, if the door has remained closed, though the rains have stopped, if your soul is aching for the sound of movement, but all you hear is the flutter of wings, listen. Look closer. He may not be shouting, but he is still speaking, maybe not through fire, but through a leaf, a wordless answer, a sacred reassurance, a covenant tucked in quietness. The flood did not win. The silence did not mean absence. And the door will open soon. But for now, this whisper is enough, so rest your spirit, hold the leaf, let it speak. Let it remind you that what was buried is beginning to grow again. Let it tell you that your God is still the keeper of promises, and that sometimes the smallest branch can carry the loudest truth. What if the first step you take after the storm isn't into freedom but into reverence? Can you imagine touching a world that's never been touched by sin? Noah stood before the door. It did not creak open like any other door. It didn't swing from the hinges. It yielded. After the waiting, the weeping, the watching, there was this, an opening, and beyond it a world that looked nothing like the one he left. No crowds, no buildings, no voices, no laughter, no shame, only sky and light, and soil that remembered rain. He stepped down, and the wood beneath him gave way to earth, soft, soaked, tender. His heel pressed into the mud, the first footprint on a new covenant, the first human imprint on a world washed clean, and the ground received him. Not as a conqueror, but as a witness. Noah did not run. He did not shout. He did not fall to his knees in triumph. He walked slow, sacred, sober. Every step was a whisper, a prayer, a remembering. The silence was holy, not empty, not eerie, holy. The trees had not yet stretched their limbs. The animals still listened to the sky. Even the wind moved carefully as if afraid to disturb what God had made still. And Noah, he did not speak. because when everything around you has been stripped away, words feel like dust. The air was thick with the scent of wet bark, new leaves, and something else, grace. Not loud grace, not the kind you dance in, but the kind that keeps you from crumbling when you realize you're alive and others aren't. The ground bore no blood, only dew, only mercy. It had rained judgment. Now it dripped with the promise of beginning again. Noah breathed it in, like a man inhaling the breath of Eden. And still, he did not build. He did not plant. He did not name anything. His first act was not to claim the land, but to honor the one who held it in his hands. He walked not as a builder, but as a priest. Because when God lets you live through what should have drowned you, you don't emerge with pride. You come out with oil in your hands, ready for the altar. There was no applause, no crown, no music, only the sound of water receding, the faint rustle of wings, and the quiet thud of his feet on the softened earth. Every step echoed eternity. Every movement was a sacred reminder that this was not just a survival, it was a resurrection, and every resurrection deserves a response. Not a speech, not a ceremony, not a blueprint, but worship. The kind that rises from the ash, from the ache, from the soil that swallowed yesterday's cries. Have you ever been there, where everything familiar is gone, where the noise is over but the silence feels just as heavy, where you're not sure if the storm left you, or if you've simply stepped into a stillness you don't know how to carry? Noah knew that ache, that awe, that weight of survival, and he didn't rush to fill it with sound. He let the silence shape his steps, because not all silence is absence. Some silence is an altar in disguise, and when God gives you new ground, the first thing you do is to give it back. So Noah placed his feet on the earth like incense, like the breath of prayer pressed into the dust. He didn't walk with a blueprint, he walked with reverence. Because the world he stepped into wasn't just dry, it was consecrated. Rain had made it holy, judgment had made it soft, waiting had made it ready. And now every footprint was a covenant. The ground had been cursed once, but now it bore witness to a man walking slowly toward a God who remembered. Can you see it? The mountain of mercy behind him, the ark resting like a sleeping promise, the air hushed, the animals are quiet, and Noah stepping forward, not into a city, not into a garden, but into sacred emptiness. An untouched canvas, a breath waiting to be spoken into. And yet he knew it was not his voice that would make this place sacred. It was his surrender, so he kept walking. And with each step the earth whispered back, "Welcome home." But this time walk slower, because the world you knew has been buried, and what rises now is not yours, it is mine. And Noah knew that before he would build a house, he must first build an altar. But before the altar, before the fire, before the offering, there was this, the first footsteps on a new earth, where even the silence was holy. What if the path to promise was paved in ashes? What if before the rainbow there had to be smoke? Noah stood still. He had walked through silence, stepped upon the soaked bones of a buried world, trembling under skies too quiet to trust. But now he gathered stones. He did not build a house. He did not plant a vineyard. He did not chase survival. He built an altar. Because sometimes before you move forward, you must kneel backward. The ground was soft, still wounded, but Noah marked it with fire. His hands, once blistered from hammers and wood, now touched stone again, not to survive, but to surrender. He built with slowness, as if stacking memory itself. Each rock was a thank you carved in silence. Each space between them a pause for God to breathe through. There was no music, no song, only the rustle of animals waiting and the beat of Noah's heart offering itself like incense. And then the fire. The first fire on the first dry land. Not for warmth, not for defense, but for worship. The flame was not loud, it did not roar, it whispered. And above it the smoke began to rise, dark and sacred, fragrant and holy. A veil of burnt offering between dust and heaven. This was not payment, it was a remembrance. Noah burned not to earn mercy, but to echo it. Because when you've walked out of a flood, you don't ask for more. You thank God you're still breathing. He chose animals not from what was easy to spare, but from what was clean, from what was precious, from what the world would need to live again. He offered life before life resumed. He gave up before he received it. Because real worship always feels like fire in the bones. It burns, but it beautifies. And as the smoke twisted skyward, it carried something more than scent. It carried surrender. It carried memory. It carried a heart that still trembled in love after judgment had passed. Have you ever lit a fire not to be seen, but to be searched? Have you ever lifted your hands in the dark when no answer came, but you lifted them anyway? That's what this was. Smoke before the rainbow, sacrifice before color, stillness before the promise. The heavens did not tremble. There was no lightning. Only the soundless stir of God's breath receiving the fragrance. The offering rose, slow and unashamed, and the sky watched. And somewhere, though the wind made no sound and the clouds gave no sign, God inhaled, and he remembered. He remembered not just Noah, but the ache of dust, the sorrow of man, the softness of repentance that smells like blood and wood and flame. And though no man saw it, heaven moved, not with thunder but with a whisper. The offering pleased him. The same fire that once rained judgment now paused, drawn to the smoke of one man's altar. Before there was covenant, there was communion. Before the vow, worship. Noah did not ask for anything. He simply gave. And God spoke, not in wrath, not in warning, but in vow. Never again, he whispered. Never again will I drown the world with weeping. Never again will judgment flood without end. Never again will the water rise without the mercy rising higher. And that vow, it was born in smoke. Can you feel it? That sacred moment when worship is answered not with reward but with presence. When God smells the surrender and says, I'm here. When the sky shifts, not because you begged, but because you believed. That's what Noah gave us. A pattern, an altar before restoration. A fire before the sun returns. A sacrifice before the rainbow is even imagined. And maybe you sitting alone tonight with your own ashes, your own silences, your own ache for something new. Maybe God is waiting, not for you to build a future, but for you to build an altar. To offer the hurt, to burn the pride, to light a flame in the rain-soaked soil of your past. Because sometimes the smoke you raise is the only language heaven needs. Not perfect words, just a heart on fire. Noah didn't light the fire to make the rain stop. It had already stopped. He lit it because love cannot walk out of judgment. In tea without falling to its knees. The rainbow will come, but only after the smoke. And in the stillness that follows, in the gray sky before the color, you'll know that God has already smelled the offering, and he is pleased. So build your altar, light the flame, let the smoke rise. Even if the rainbow feels far away, let it rise. Have you ever seen a promise that didn't speak but shimmered? Not with sound, but with color. Not a voice, but a vision hung across the sky like a vow. Noah looked up. And the world, still wet with memory, was suddenly crowned with light. A bow, but not the kind held in war. No arrow, no string, only curves, only color, only God writing with radiance. It didn't thunder, it didn't crack the sky, it simply stood there, soft but unbreakable. The storm had spoken of wrath, but the rainbow whispered of restraint. A divine hush stretched between heaven and earth, and God broke it gently. This is my covenant. Not carved in stone, but in the sky. Not written in fire, but in the spectrum. A promise not made because man deserved it, but because love endures even when the earth cannot. The bow faced upward, not at man. It was pointed away, turned toward the heavens as if to say, should justice rise again, let it strike me first. Have you ever considered that? That the first weapon laid down was not in battle, but in mercy. That before the sword of judgment was sheathed forever, God turned it on himself in promise. Because real power isn't proven by how you punish, but by how you pardon. And Noah, still damp with deliverance, watched as colors bled across the clouds. Red, gold, blue, blood, glory, spirit. A divine signature on the scroll of the sky. It didn't dry the ground. It didn't undo the loss. But it did something deeper. It restored the trust that the ground would never drown again, that the breath in Noah's lungs would never again tremble beneath a ceiling of rising judgment. That children born from his blood would never have to build boats with trembling hands to outrun wrath. And that was all because of light. God would have spoken thunder again. He could have carved his vow in flame. He could have split the mountain and branded the earth, but instead he painted a whisper, a covenant in color, a stillness that said more than any speech. Because sometimes God doesn't speak to be understood, he speaks to be trusted. Noah didn't ask for a sign. He didn't demand a token. He simply sacrificed. And God answered not with applause but with beauty. Have you ever seen a rainbow in your own wilderness? When everything's still wet with sorrow and God decides not to explain the storm but to crown it with light, that's a covenant. That's grace painted across your grief. A bow not to defend but to declare, I am still here, I remember, and I will not let judgment rule again. The rainbow does not erase the flood. It does not silence the cries that once rose from the waters, but it reframes them. It says, yes, wrath came, but mercy came after, and mercy will remain. Do you know what it feels like to stand in that moment, where the past still drips from your skin, but God is already showing you color? Where you're not clean yet, not whole yet, but you're seen? That's what Noah felt. Not victory, but vision. Not arrival, but assurance. A bow, silent and sacred, held in the sky by unseen hands. Not to decorate, but to remember. And isn't that what we long for at night? A light that doesn't demand attention, but give it. A sign that God sees even when we can't speak. He could have sent fire. He could have sent thunder, but he sent color. Color in a world that had only known gray. Color in a sky that had only wept. A promise, written not in ink, but in the atmosphere. And every time rain gathers again, every time clouds threaten, that bow returns. Not because we ask for it, but because he promised it. And his promises are not whispers in the wind. They are weapons laid down, declarations hung high, bows that do not bend in anger but in awe. So if you are tired tonight, if your skies are heavy and your ground is still wet with regret, look up. There is a covenant not made with your strength but with his mercy. A bow without arrows, a promise without expiration. A God who doesn't just speak light, he becomes it, and paints it above you even when you don't know how to believe again. So let the rainbow remind you judgment passed, mercy remained, and God is still speaking in color. Have you ever been rescued and still wandered? Have you ever been spared and still stumbled? The flood had ended. The rain had rested. The bow still curved above the earth like a promise. And yet Noah planted a vineyard. Not a battlefield, not a temple, not a memorial, a vineyard. The same hands that built the ark now dug into soil to grow wine. And who could blame him? After carrying the weight of the world, after nights haunted by the groaning of a drowned earth, he longed to forget. We all do. After the storm, aft. The survival, after the silence, the ache of memory becomes too loud. So Noah drank, and the wine whispered what the water could not wash. He drank, and the man who once stood between heaven and judgment fell asleep under the vines of his own making. It didn't start with sin. It started with sorrow. Not rebellion, but release. But isn't that how it happens? We survive the flood, but forget that salvation isn't the end, it's the beginning. Noah was covered in grace. But now, he was uncovered in the dust. A naked man in a tent, in a vineyard, in a world scrubbed clean but not yet holy. Because sin doesn't need cities to return, it needs memory, it needs weakness, it needs a crack in the altar of the heart. The flood washed the earth, but the heart still held the wilderness. And Noah, the preacher of righteousness, the vessel of deliverance, the man of God, lay drunk and exposed, not in rebellion but in retreat. This is the part of the story they rarely preach. That even the faithful have faults, even the rescued I still wrestle, even the chosen can be caught in shadows, because surviving judgment is not the same as surrendering to holiness. The vineyard was not a sin, but it became a sanctuary of forgetfulness. It offered the sweetness of escape without the bitterness of repentance. And so Noah drank, and the man who had once stood firm in a flood now lay folded in silence, uncovered, not just his body, but the fragile truth that even the righteous bleed. Have you ever had a vineyard of your own, a place you planted not in rebellion but in exhaustion, a field you sowed because the ache of remembering was it too great, and you told yourself it was rest, but it was a retreat. You told yourself it was relief, but it became a wilderness. Noah didn't curse God. He didn't build an altar to idols. He simply let his guard down. And sometimes the shadow doesn't enter through defiance but through fatigue, because when the storm ends, so does the urgency. And the soul relaxes its armor, but the enemy never sleeps. And in the quiet of the vineyard, when no one was watching, the serpent slithered back in, not to tempt, but to accuse, to whisper, even your heroes fall. Noah's nakedness wasn't just skin deep, it was spiritual. It was the unveiling of a deeper truth, that even those who walk with God must still watch over their hearts after the rain, because sometimes the wine we drink isn't from grapes, but from grief. And when we drink to forget, we often forget who we are. So Noah slept. And the man who had once prophesied the storm became a caution in the sunlight. And the ark, now dry and still, could not carry him out of this, because this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about surrender. Have you ever stood in that place, where you're saved but not whole, where the boat has landed but your soul still drifts, where your hands are clean but your thoughts ache with old wine? That's the vineyard. And many have wandered into it thinking it was a garden, but it's not Eden. It's an exile in disguise. And Noah, the one who heard God's voice through the storm, now I have heard nothing. Because sometimes heaven is silent when the heart is numb, and God waits for the wine to wear off, waits for the soul to remember, waiting for the man who survived to surrender again, because the ark was a miracle, but sanctification is a daily altar, and even the righteous must return to it. So if you are here tonight, tired after the flood, planting vineyards just to feel something, know this: you are not disqualified, you are not forgotten, but you are being invited back to the altar, back to the oil, back to the whisper beneath the wine, because survival is not sanctification. And the God who rescued you from the water wants to walk with you on the dry land. Even now, have you ever seen something you were never meant to see? Not because it was hidden in darkness, but because it was sacred, because it was someone's weakness and not yours to touch. The storm was over, the ark had landed, the air smelled of wet soil and silence, and Noah, God's chosen, had fallen asleep in the shadow of his vineyard, uncovered, unarmored, unaware. And into that tent walked Ham, one of Noah's own sons, one who had been inside the ark, one who had seen God's mercy carve a path through wrath, one who had been saved but whose heart still knew no reverence. He looked. And he kept looking. There are moments when the eyes become a sword, moments when gazing becomes dishonor. Ham could have turned away, he could have covered what was sacred, he could have walked backward in silence. He could have guarded his father's dignity like a holy flame, but he didn't. He saw weakness and chose exposure. He saw nakedness and chose the power of being a witness. Because sometimes the most dangerous sin isn't what we do in darkness, but what we do in light without compassion. He left the tent and told his brothers, not with concern, not why. Mourning, but with a grin tucked behind the words. And maybe that's the part that stings the most. That Ham did not bring a blanket, he brought a report. He didn't kneel, he judged. He didn't protect, he was exposed. There's a sacredness to cover someone's weakness, not to excuse it, not to pretend it didn't happen, but to honor the image of God even when it trembles, to turn away when the flesh is exposed, to guard the altar when it smokes in shame. Shem and Japheth heard their brother's words and said nothing. Instead, they found a garment. They walked backward step by step with reverence, with stillness, with tears in their breath. And when they reached their father, they covered him, not with gossip, not with judgment, but with a blanket and a bowed heart. Because sometimes love doesn't confront first, it covers, not to shield sin, but to protect the soul until it can rise again. They never saw his nakedness, because they refused to look. And perhaps that's what holiness looks like after the flood, not just surviving the wrath of God, but carrying the gentleness to guard one another's humanity. Ham wanted to be a witness, but his brothers chose to be intercessors. There are eyes that break things when they stare, and there are eyes that restore things by turning away. And still Noah woke, the man of the flood, the preacher of righteousness, the ark builder, and he knew what had happened. There are wounds you don't need to see to feel. There is betrayal that echoes even in silence, And Noah opened his mouth and spoke a curse, but not over Ham directly, over Ham's son, Canaan. The shadow passed down, a seed of mockery planted in a bloodline. Because what you do in a single moment of dishonor can ripple for generations. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all, that we can survive the flood and still fracture the future by how we treat the vulnerable, by how we respond when those we admire fail. Do we cover, or do we report? Do we walk backward with honor, or forward with a spotlight? Because the tent will always appear again, and someone you love will fall asleep uncovered, and your choice will echo into eternity. You don't have to understand their fall to protect their dignity. You don't have to approve of their weakness to guard their image. You simply have to remember you've been uncovered too, and it was mercy that covered you. The same breath that shaped the stars once formed man from dust and wrapped him in garments, not of shame but of grace. God has always covered what man uncovers, and now he calls you to do the same. So if you've looked where you shouldn't have looked, if you've spoken what should have stayed in silence, if you've judged before you ever covered, return. Walk backward, find the garment, honor the broken, and protect what is sacred in the quiet. Because sometimes the holiest thing you can do is turn your eyes away. Can you feel it? The heaviness that lingers after the rain has stopped. It is not water that clings to the earth now, but consequence. The ground is dry, but something deeper remains flooded. A bloodline, a curse, a whisper in the soil that will grow with time. Noah opened his eyes from the shame of the vineyard. He had survived judgment, but now stood inside another kind, not of water, but of legacy. His son had sinned not with his hands, but with his gaze, not with a weapon, but with a dishonoring spirit. And the wound Noah felt wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. So he stood an old man, still scented by the altar's smoke, and he looked not at Ham, but Ham's son, Canaan, a child, an heir. And from Noah's mouth, the words came like thunder rising from ancient dust. Cursed be Canaan, not as revenge, but as echo, because sometimes what begins in a single look carries through generations like fire. A servant of servants shall he be, chains before empires, struggle before cities, the seed of bondage spoken into time. Noah's words didn't only name the boy, they named the war that would come. A war not with swords, but with spirits. A war between reverence and rebellion, between covering and exposure, between blessing and dishonor. And so the curse became a shadow on the family tree, a quiet exile inside the bloodline. Can you imagine being born carrying a curse you didn't choose? A heaviness you didn't earn, but the soil remembers, and the spirit realm does not forget. Canaan would grow, his children would rise, cities would be built, walls, temples, idols, kings. But beneath every stone was the bruise of a father's judgment. And that bruise would bleed into nations. Generations later, Israel would face Canaan's descendants. The promised land would not come easily. It was occupied by the very bloodline born from Ham's dishonor. The curse became a conflict. The prophecy became a battlefield. Because the spiritual realm does not forget what man tries to bury. Canaan's curse was not just a punishment, it was a warning. That sin, even after the storm, still has the power to shape nations. That the flood washed the earth but not the heart. That salvation from wrath does not mean escape from discipline. And here's what haunts the silence, that even in a cleansed world the serpent still speaks. Even on dry land there are roots of rebellion beneath the surface. The curse was not the end. It was the beginning of another kind of war, one not fought with water but with bloodlines, choices, and the long unraveling of disobedience. Ham looked once. Canaan carried it forever. But here is the sacred ache. Even curses can become altars. Even shadows can be interrupted. Because while Noah spoke a curse, God, in his timeless mercy, would not abandon even the cursed ones. He would allow the story to unfold. He would raise up prophets to cry in the wilderness, judges to bring back justice, kings who remembered the altar. And though Canaan's line brought forth enemies, it also brought forth opportunity to forgive, to rebuild, to learn what not to become, and perhaps to break the echo. Because you who now walk under the weight of what your ancestors did, you are not bound to repeat them. You who carry shadows, you can still turn your face to the light. You who inherited silence, brokenness, and shame, you can still choose blessings. The spiritual war that started with a curse will not end with one. The bow in the sky still stretches overhead, not toward man but toward heaven. God remembers, even when the world forgets. And every curse spoken by man can be answered by the mercy of God. No accursed, but God still called. The ground may have held a curse, but heaven held a promise. And so the generations begin. Canaan's sons and Shem's sons and Japheth's sons. Nations rising, stories unfolding, wars, wanderings, altars built and broken. And through it all, the whisper of God's covenant never fades, because curses echo but grace roars. So if you feel like Canaan, like someone before you looked when they should have turned away, if you feel like you were born beneath a shadow, not a sunrise, if you walk through life trying to undo what was spoken before you could speak, let this moment wrap around you like light. God is not finished with your name. Not even if the first time it was spoken, it came through pain. He can redeem what men curse. He can bless what history buried. He can take a broken lineage and write a new legacy. And maybe, just maybe, he's waiting for you to be the interruption, the one who walks backward with honor, the one who builds altars instead of idols, the one who says, no more echoes, no more shadows, it ends with me. The flood washed the earth, the curse fractured the family, but the covenant is still open, and grace still runs deeper than blood. Have you ever wondered how quickly do we forget? Not the forgetting of birthdays or names, but the forgetting of fear, of mercy, of God. The kind of forgetting that creeps in when survival becomes comfort. The kind of forgetting that turns altars into blueprints and worship into ambition. There was a time when the whole world was water, when every breath came with prayer, when salvation had a shape, wood, pitch, a door shut by God's own hand. There was a time when silence covered the earth and the only voices heard were those whispering thanks for another day alive. But time has a way of softening memory, and pride has a way of sharpening desire. They were the children of survivors born from those who had seen the flood, heard the groaning of the ark, touched dry land like it was holy ground. But their feet wandered far from where their fathers had bowed. They did not remember the waters. They remembered only the climb. And so they built. Not with reverence but with rebellion, not toward God but in defiance of him. A city, a tower, a plan, bricks stacked like declarations. Each stone saying, we will not be scattered. Each beam whispering, we will reach heaven ourselves. What once was fear of the flood became arrogant in the drought. What once was dependence on grace became obsessed with glory. They gathered not to worship but to rise, to become more than men were made to be. And can you feel it? That same spirit is still alive today. The spirit that forgets that every breath is borrowed, that every sunrise is mercy, that every step forward should be in step with God. They forgot. And in their forgetting they built, with bricks hardened by pride, with hands that no longer trembled, with tongues that are no longer blessed. They said, let us make a name for ourselves, as if survival had not been a gift, as if mercy were not enough, as if their names could stand where only God's name belonged. And the tower rose, not just in height, but in my heart, a monument to forgetting, a shrine to ego, a staircase meant to storm the skies. But heaven is not reached by climbing. Heaven bows to the humble, heaven listens to the lowly, and heaven watches when man begins to forget. God came not because he feared their tower, but because he saw their hearts. He saw the dust trying to become divine. He saw creatures of breath trying to dethrone the Creator. And he remembered the flood, the covenant, the promise in the sky, but they had not remembered. They had remembered bricks but not the altar, ambition but not the ark. And so God scattered them, not with wrath but with mercy. He confused their tongues. He broke their unity, not to punish them, but to protect them from the destruction pride always brings. Because when man forgets mercy, he builds monuments to himself. And those monuments always crumble not by floodwaters but by the weight of their own arrogance. There's a silence in the story of Babel that feels like a warning, not loud, not thunderous, but soft, like a whisper in your soul. Remember. Remember the flood. Remember the altar. Remember the whisper that saved you when you thought you'd drown. Because the danger is not just in sin. It is in forgetting that you were rescued. The flood was not just a moment in time, it was a marking. And when the memory fades, pride floods in to replace it. They built cities, but forgot the cost. They laid foundations, but forgot the mercy that let them live long enough to build it all. They reached for the skies, but forgot the one who made them. And in forgetting, they lost themselves. So let this be the gentle ache you feel tonight, to remember, to look back, to whisper thanks, to build not towers but altars, because ego is louder than thunder, but remembrance is stronger than pride. And the one who remembers will never need a monument, only a whisper, only grace, only God. What if unity, isn't it always holy? What if speaking the same language can become more dangerous than not understanding each other at all? In the early morning of the world, when dew still clung to the mountains and the breath of God still echoed in the wind, the children of the flood gathered in the valley of Shinar. Their hearts beat with the same rhythm. Their tongues sang the same song. Their hands moved with one purpose, one tongue, one person, one tower, and with it, one rebellion. It did not begin with rage. It did not begin with war. It began with whispers, with the quiet ambition of those who had survived mercy but had not bowed to it. They said, "Come, let us build." Not for shelter, not for worship, but to rise, to touch heaven, to be remembered, to be God's. Unity without reverence is rebellion in disguise, because when man joins hands without first bending knees, he builds monuments to himself, not to God. The tower was not evil because it was tall. It was evil because it was proud. Each brick laid was a declaration of self-sufficiency. Each stone stacked was a denial of the altar. There were no prayers in their plans. Only progress, no silence, only strategy, no trembling, only blueprints. And their language, so united, so smooth, became the very rope with which they tied themselves to pride. Can you imagine a people so together that they no longer needed God? Not because he was absent, but because they had no room for him. Their voices echoed through the valley with purpose but not purity, with passion but not prayer. And in that place heaven watched. Watched men who had once floated on judgment now dig their heels into dust as if the earth was theirs to command. Watched mouths, once silent in awe, now speak only of their own glory. Watched hands, once lifted in worship, now shape towers meant to replace the throne of God. The tower rose, not just in height but in my heart, a ladder of rebellion, a monument of forgetfulness, a ziggurat of ego. But God is not mocked by stone and straw. He descended, not to strike but to scatter. He confused their tongues, split their sounds, fractured their false unity. And suddenly the hands that had moved in rhythm no longer recognized each other. The song shattered, the bricks fell. The tower paused in mid-breath, unfinished forever, because heaven had interrupted. This is the mercy of disruption. Sometimes God breaks what you build to save you from what it would become. Sometimes he scatters so you can be gathered again, but in reverence this time. They thought their unity was strength, but unity without submission is a sword drawn toward heaven. And God will not let that sword strike. He will bend it, break it, melt it down until it becomes a plowshare once more, because the highest towers are not the ones that reach upward. They are the ones that kneel low and tremble before the Lord. There's something haunting about a people who speak the same but forget who gave them the speech, about a generation that builds with perfect precision but loses sacred direction, about hearts that align with each other but not with heaven. One tongue, one tower. But no altar, no whisper, no offering, no oil poured out before the Lord, only myself, only echo. And echo is not present tonight if your heart eels scattered, if your plans lie unfinished, if your speech no longer connects. Perhaps it is mercy. Perhaps God is saving you from building something he was never blessed. Perhaps he is confusing your path not out of cruelty but compassion, because he still tears down towers built in pride, and he still speaks in the silence that follows. Let the tower fall. Let the plans unravel. Let the language of heaven return to your lips. A whisper, a prayer, a name. The only name worth remembering. Not yours, not mine. High, always his. Can you imagine a God so high he must stoop to see our towers, so holy that even our greatest efforts look like dust stacked on dust? They built upward, stone upon stone, dream upon dream. Heaven was not their destination, it was their defiance. And God came down, not with water, not with thunder, not with fire, but with confusion. They were not drowned, they were divided. They were not punished with storms, they were undone by their own voices. Because sometimes God does not crush you to save you. He confuses you. He unthreads the language that led you to pride. He interrupts the unity that pointed away from him. This is a different kind of judgment, not on the body but on the heart. The flood washed the flesh, but Babel humbled the soul. In the valley of Shinar, where shadows of rebellion stretched tall, God did not roar. He whispered disorder. And in a moment the workers froze, their hammers still. Their eyes widened. Their tongues split. The man who passed the brick could no longer be understood. The woman who carved the pattern now spoke a sound no one could return. And just like that, progress became paused, and pause became scattering. Heaven had come down not to admire but to interrupt, to remind man that assent without obedience is not worship but war. They thought they could rise, but God is not reached by ladders. He is found on knees, in ashes, by altars. He is not summoned by bricks or blueprints. He is drawn by broken hearts and trembling prayers. Have you ever been confused at the very edge of success? Have your plans ever unraveled just as you felt closest to the top? Maybe God came down, not to destroy you but to realign you, because unfinished towers can be acts of mercy. He scattered them, but he did not abandon them. He confused their language, but he never confused his love. Each tribe, each tongue, each people walking away carried the breath of God still in their lungs. Even judgment was wrapped in compassion. Because the God who came down, I have not finished writing the story. There would be other mountains, other tongues, another descent not to divide but to gather, not to confuse but to anoint. But that moment had not yet come, for now he humbled their ambition, because man's greatest mistake is forgetting who the heights belong to. The heavens do not bend to us, we bow to them. The throne of God is not reached by stone, it is revealed in silence, in surrender. In the place where the proud fall and the desperate lift their eyes not to build but to beg for mercy. What tower are you building tonight? What monument have you crafted from fear or ego or the ache to be seen? Have your hands been busy but your heart far? Has your tongue grown fluent in goals but silent in prayer? He comes down still, into our towers, into our plans, into the very blueprints we thought it was holy. And when he does, he breaks only what would have broken us. He does not ruin, he redirects. He does not hate the builder, he rescues him. He does not despise our languages, he speaks in all of them. From this valley of confusion will one day rise a mountain of fire. From scattered tribes will one day come tongues of flame. From Babel to Pentecost, from pride to promise. But for now they walked away, stone still in hand, plans half finished, hearts echoing with sounds they could no longer share. And in the silence that followed, the tower stood unfinished forever, a monument to the mercy of being stopped in time. Because not all unfinished things are failures. Some are altars in disguise. Some are the fingerprints of a God who came down not to punish but to protect, not to flood but to scatter, not to silence but to make room for a better song. One not sung in one tongue but in many, all of them longing for home. Let your tower fall, let your language scatter, and wait, he will come down again. But this time to fill, not confuse, to seal, not separate, to pour oil where pride once stood. And in the shadow of Babel, a cross will one day rise, a place where every tongue will kneel and every knee will confess. Until then, scatter if you must, But do not forget the God who comes down still calls you by name. What if the flood was never just a story of the past, but a shadow of what's still to come? What if the rain that once drowned the world is a mirror for the storms that still find their way into your soul? The flood ended, but the sky never forgot how to weep. Indeed, neither have we, because the rain will return, not just in water, but in weariness, not just in storms that fall from the sky, but in battles that rise from within. Have you ever felt it, the slow gathering of clouds in your chest, a grief too heavy to explain, a silence too loud to bear? Sometimes the flood does not begin in the heavens, but in the heart. And the question is no longer, will it rain again? The question is, where will I stand when it does? The ark was built once out of wood and pitch, but now you are the vessel. You are the place he shelters when judgment draws near, not because you're worthy, but because you're willing. Because the same God who closed Noah in now covers you with something stronger than timber, his mercy, his wings, his whisper. Did you know that every storm you've survived wasn't just about survival? It was about remembrance. To remember who kept you afloat when everything around you drowned. To remember that he didn't just stop the storm, he sent it for your salvation. And yet the world forgets, just like they did after the first flood. We build, we strive. We rise with dry feet but wet hearts. We forget the waters that once threatened to consume us. We forget the altar we promised to build once the sky cleared. And so the rain returns, not to destroy but to awaken. To remind the earth that heaven still weeps when we wander, because the flood was never just a punishment. It was a cry, a cleansing. It was God wiping the dust of rebellion from his creation. And now he washes the dust from your soul, not with wrath but with rain. The kind that falls at 3 a.m. when you're alone, half asleep and wondering if the silence means he left. He didn't. He's just letting the storm draw you closer. The thunder that shakes your chest isn't anger, it's an invitation. The lightning that splits your plans isn't destruction, it's direction. He uses storms to bring you back to the altar, to the place where the fire meets the wood and the offering is your surrender, because you don't need another ark of wood. You need a heart that hears, a spirit that remembers how to kneel before the rain turns into waves. What if tonight you could rebuild the altar before the next storm comes? What if the rainbow wasn't just the end of the flood, but the beginning of your remembering? It still hangs in the sky, not as decoration, but as a covenant. A vow etched in light across the heavens, a bow pointed away from you, God's weapon of war hung up forever. But even that promise doesn't mean the rain won't fall again. It means when it does, he will be with you inside it. The flood may return in spirit, but so will the ark. So will the altar. So will the whisper in the storm. You are not waiting for safety. You are waiting for stillness. The kind that only comes when your soul rests in the hands that once shut Noah in while the world outside was swallowed. What if this rain isn't the end? What if it's the beginning of something holy? What if every drop is God's way of softening the earth of your heart, to prepare the soil for something to grow? For a vineyard perhaps, or a promise, or a resurrection, because the rain will return, but so will the voice. The one who speaks not after the storm, but inside it. The one who does not silence the flood by shouting louder, but by whispering deeper. Let it rain. Let it ache. Let it wash away everything you built on pride, on fear, on forgetting. And let it carry you back to him, back to the ark, back to the altar, back to the bow and the sky. Because even when it rains again, you already know the ending. Have you ever wondered what it means to carry something sacred in a world that no longer believes the flood ever happened? Noah's ark was made of wood, but yours is not. Yours is invisible, but just as real, just as heavy, because the flood still comes. Only now it doesn't begin in the clouds. It begins in the soul, and in this storm you are the ark. You are the one who listens when others laugh, the one who builds when there is no rain in sight, the one who prepares in the silence for something no one else sees. The spirit of Noah was not just about survival, it was obedience in obscurity. He built for years, not with applause, but with whispers of heaven. And now that same whisper reaches you. not with blueprints made of gopher wood, but with instructions written on the heart. Build, wait, trust. Can you feel it? That quiet invitation to carry the sacred in a world of shadows, to be a vessel in an age that has forgotten how to float. We are not building walls and sails. We are building altars with our choices. We are sealing windows with our tears. We are carrying animals not in pairs, but in prayers. And the pitch that holds us together is not tar, but trust. The ark lives now in the breath you give to God when no one sees. It lives in the silence you choose over chaos. It lives in the reverence you carry when you forgive instead of cursing. You are Noah not in name but in nature. You feel the sky shift before others look up. You sense the rain before a drop falls, because your heart has learned to hear the thunder in the distance of a disobedient world. And still you obey, you build, you wait, even when they mock you, even when they say there is no need for arks anymore. You know better, you remember, not just the flood but the voice, the one who warned not out of wrath but mercy, the one who saw you worthy of survival because he saw you willing to surrender. Noah carried animals. You carry altars. He carried a structure. You carry a promise. He heard the command. You hear the whisper, do not despise your waiting, it is holy. Every nail Noah hammered was a prayer. Every beam he raised was a sermon to the wind. And every moment you remain faithful in the face of silence, you are building an ark of trust, of listening, of sacred resistance to a world drunk on its own pride. Did you know the ark had no rudder? Because obedience doesn't steer, it floats. It surrenders to the hand that holds the flood itself. So don't be afraid if you do know where you're going. Just make sure the ark you carry has room for worship. Because when the flood comes again, and it will, only those who carry him will rise. Carry the ark within. Let your mind be its walls. Let your worship be its pitch. Let your obedience be its door. Let your patience be its window. And when the storm surrounds you, remember, you were not made to drown. You were made to drift toward something holy. Noah survived because he listened. And now the Spirit asks if you will do the same. Can you obey when you don't see the clouds? Can you build when you don't hear applause? Can you carry the sacred when it feels like you're the only one who remembers what does it mean to walk with God? There is no more ark of wood, but there are still floods, and there are still survivors. You are one of them, so walk slowly, build quietly, pray like hammer to nail, fast like lifting a beam. And when they say, "What are you doing?" say nothing. Just keep building what they cannot see. Because one day, when the world shakes again, when the sky breaks open, they will remember. They will ask where to run. And your life will be the shelter, because you didn't just carry your faith. You carried the ark within. And when the storm came, you floated while others fell. Not because you were strong, but because you were faithful. And that was enough. What if the darkest part of the storm was never the wind, never the rain, but the silence that followed? What if the most sacred promise wasn't shouted from heaven, but whispered in color, painted across a sky too heavy to hold any more tears? Have you ever looked up while your soul was still drenched and seen light bend over your life like a bow drawn in mercy? That was not decoration. That was not an accident. It was a covenant. The sky remembers what the earth forgets. Even when men no longer recall the flood, the sky does. Even when your heart forgets what God promised, the clouds carry it still. A bow curved, not straight, pointed upward, not down, not a weapon of wrath, but a symbol of restraint, not a mark of war, but a sign of peace. God hung up his bow. He laid down his judgment. He placed his weapon in the clouds to say, "I will remember." Can you imagine that? A God who doesn't need reminders, yet chooses to tie his mercy to the sky so that every time your eyes lift from the flood, you'll know. He's still here, still watching, still holding back what you don't even know you deserve, still remembering your name in a world that forgets you. That bow in the sky was drawn in light but forged in blood. It came after the altar, after the smoke, after Noah's trembling offering. It came as a reply to reverence, and it remains as a sentinel above your storms. The rainbow is not cute. It is not casual. It is a covenant. It is a ribbon of God's restraint stretched across your rebellion. It is a vow that mercy will always outshine wrath, not because we deserve it, but because He is good. Even now, when the sky is heavy and your heart is tired, even now the covenant holds. When your prayers feel like whispers lost in thunder, He hears. When the floodwaters rise in your mind again, He sees. And when you fear you've drifted too far, He remembers. Not just Noah, not just then. You too are written in the sky. Can you feel it? That sacred hush after the storm rages, when the clouds begin to part but the ache still lingers. That is where the rainbow lives. Not in bright skies, but in the bruised ones. Not in perfect weather, but in weathered hearts. The rainbow waits for those who survive something they thought it would end them. And you are still here, still breathing, still building, still believing, even when your faith flickers like a candle in a hurricane. Lift your eyes. There is color even on this night. God did not promise there would never be storm. He promised He would never forsake you in them. He did not say you would never be wounded. He said He would never wound without healing. The rainbow is not the absence of pain, it is the presence of purpose. It is the soft voice of heaven saying, "You are not forgotten, you are not forsaken, you are not finished." Even if all you see is gray, the light is still there. Even if your hands are trembling from holding on too long, He has not let go. The bow is still above you. Drawn not in judgment, but in remembrance. A reminder that the same God who once flooded the world also held back the final drop so that mercy would win. He still holds it back, every day. For you, do you see it? Not always with your eyes, but with your soul. That promise arching across the storm like the breath of God laid gently over your wounds. Even now, when you feel small, scattered, exiled inside your own heart, He sends color into your gray. He bends the light so you will remember you were always seen, always kept, always known. You are not forgotten even when the silence says otherwise, because heaven cannot forget what was written in the covenant, and mercy always remembers your name. So sleep tonight not with fear in your bones, but with light above your night. The ark has rested, the altar has burned, the storm has passed, but the promise remains. A bow in the clouds drawn by God Himself to remind the weary you are still His. And He is still yours, even here, even now, even after everything.